She gave her best friend a counselor's card instead of revenge. But what Vivienne Hartford did not know as she walked away from that hallway was that grace, in the wrong hands, can be mistaken for weakness. And weakness, to the people circling her life, like wolves who had never stopped watching, was an open door. Go back with me. 14 months after the church. 14 months after Camille Rhodes walked her rich fiancé Derek Weston down the aisle of Vivienne's own wedding in a dress the color of champagne, his cologne still carrying the scent of everything Vivienne had given him. 14 months after Vivienne Hartford walked away from that altar with cream roses falling from her hands and rebuilt herself so quietly, so completely, when that the people who destroyed her never saw what she was becoming until she was already sitting at the right hand of the man who owned everything they had. They saw it then. In a boardroom on the 14th floor of Weston and Crane Real Estate, they saw it in the nameplate that read E. Crane, principal owner, and in the face of the woman beside him. The poor crippled man's wife, they had called her. The woman who had settled, they had whispered. Sitting there with the calm of someone who had never needed their approval and had simply been waiting for them to understand that. But here is what part one did not tell you. Here is what was buried so deeply inside the founding charter of Weston and Crane Real Estate that not even Vivienne knew it existed. A sealed document locked inside the company's original legal files. That revealed something so staggering, it reframes everything you thought you understood about how Vivienne Hartford and Elliot Crane found each other at a rain-soaked bus stop on Meridian Street. Their parents had met before them. Elliot's father and Vivienne's mother, the woman who grew dahlias in window boxes and believed that beauty was an act of resistance, had been silent business partners in the earliest days of what would become Weston and Crane Real Estate. Their connection had been deliberately, carefully, illegally buried by someone who was still alive, still powerful, still inside the company, and about to walk back into Vivienne's life wearing the face of someone she had never met, but who had been watching her from the moment Elliot put a ring on her finger. There is a thing that happens to people who survive betrayal and choose grace. The world sends them a second test, not because they failed the first one, because they passed it. Her name was Alexandra Voss, Elliot's former fiancée, the woman who had left him the day the wheelchair became permanent, calculated that a crippled man was a poor investment, and spent 3 years watching from a careful distance, but who had now returned with the cold, precise fury of a woman who understands too late that she made the worst miscalculation of her life. Alexandra did not come back for love. She came back for the company, and the weapon she chose was the most vulnerable person in the room. Camille, still fragile, still rebuilding, still only 3 weeks into the counseling that Vivienne's grace had made possible. And then there was Derek. Derek, who had not gone quietly. Derek, who had been sitting in his smaller office across the city building, something in the dark. A hostile acquisition play, a weapon assembled from investor money and wounded pride, and a very selective version of the truth. But who had accidentally, in the process of building his weapon, unearthed the buried document, the one connecting Vivienne's mother to Elliot's father, the one that someone powerful had spent years and significant money keeping hidden. Derek did not yet understand what he was holding, but he was about to use it, and when he did, it would detonate everything, including himself. So ask yourself this. When the buried secret surfaces, when Alexandra's plan is already in motion, and when Derek pulls the pin on a weapon he cannot control, what does Vivienne do? What does Elliot do when the truth about his father forces him to choose between the company he built and the wife he found? And what does Camille do when Alexandra offers her everything she lost in exchange for the one thing that would destroy the only person who ever showed her grace? What they all do will shock you, but what Vivienne does, for the second time, will be even more unthinkable than the first. Dear viewers, Part 2 of this story will teach you that grace is not weakness, discernment is not cruelty, and the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it is buried or how much it costs someone to keep it hidden. You will learn the difference between forgiving someone and trusting them again, why dangerous people always reveal themselves through their own impatience, and what it truly means to stand in your purpose when everything around you is designed to make you doubt it. Watch until the very end. Then drop in the comments which character's journey surprised you most in part 2, and tell me, if you were Camille standing at that crossroads, which way would you turn? Subscribe now, because this story is just getting started. 3 weeks after the boardroom, the dahlias on the windowsill were blooming, deep burgundy, the color of something that had decided to be beautiful despite everything. And Vivienne Hartford was sitting at the kitchen table with her 4th leather notebook open in front of her, writing the way she always wrote in the mornings, slowly and without agenda, letting the words find their own shape before the day arrived with its demands. Elliot was in the next room. She could hear the quiet rhythm of his morning, the particular sound of his wheelchair on the hardwood, the kettle, the specific silence of a man who had learned long ago how to be present in a space without filling it unnecessarily. She had been married to him for 7 months, and every morning she woke beside him felt like a small, deliberate act of proof. Proof that the worst thing that had ever happened to her had also been, in some way she was still mapping, the most necessary. But this morning something was different. Elliot came to the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of tea and an expression she had learned to read in the careful way you learn to read weather. Not by the dramatic signs, but by the subtle ones. The way the light changed before the storm arrived. He set her cup beside her notebook and sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. But the nothing had weight. Alexandra Voss called the office yesterday, he said. Vivienne looked up. She did not know the name. But the way Elliot said it, with the specific flatness of a man choosing his tone very carefully, told her that the name carried history he had not yet shared. Who is she? Vivienne asked. Elliot wrapped both hands around his cup. Someone I used to know, he said. And then, because he was constitutionally incapable of the kind of selective honesty that had destroyed Vivienne once before, he added, someone I was engaged to, before the accident. The kitchen held the information quietly between them. Vivienne did not react the way a lesser version of herself might have, with jealousy, with insecurity, and with the reflexive anxiety of a woman who had been replaced before and knew exactly how it felt. She reacted the way the woman in the 4th leather notebook reacted, with stillness and precision and the particular alertness of someone whose instincts had been sharpened, not dulled, by everything she had survived. Why is she calling now? Vivienne said. That, Elliot said, is exactly the right question. What he told her next was partial, not because he was hiding anything, but because he did not yet have the full picture himself. Alexandra had contacted his office through a legal intermediary, requesting a meeting regarding what her representatives described as a matter pertaining to the company's original founding documentation. It was formal, it was precise, and it was, the Elliot's legal team had noted with the careful understatement of people paid to remain calm, potentially significant. Vivienne closed her notebook. Show me the founding documentation, she said. Elliot looked at her for a moment. That same look he had given her at the bus stop, the one that said he found her genuinely interesting, and then he nodded. What they found inside the founding charter of Weston and Crane Real Estate that morning, sitting together at the kitchen table with the dahlias blooming on the windowsill and the tea going cold between them, was not what either of them expected. It was a sealed addendum, legally obscure, deliberately buried in language designed to make it invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it, that listed among the original silent founding partners of the company, a name that made Vivienne's hand go completely still on the page, Margaret Hartford, her mother. The woman who had grown dahlias in window boxes and driven 4 hours to sit beside her daughter at every important moment of her life, who had died 3 years ago in the quiet, unglamorous way that good people sometimes leave the world, without drama, without unfinished business, or so Vivienne had believed, had been a founding partner of the company that her husband owned, the company that Camille and Derek had worked for, the company whose nameplate had read E. Crane, principal owner, while Vivienne sat beside him and felt the floor fall away beneath the people who had betrayed her. Her mother had been part of this story before Vivienne was, and someone had paid a great deal of money to make sure she never found out. Maybe Vivienne sat with that truth for a long time, Long enough for the tea to go completely cold? Long enough for the morning light to shift across the kitchen floor? Long enough for something that had been sleeping inside her since her mother's funeral to wake up and become, very quietly, very completely, furious. "Who buried this?" she said. Elliot's jaw tightened. "That," he said, "is what Alexandra Voss is coming to find out if we already know." But what Vivienne and Elliot did not yet know, what was happening at that exact moment in a glass-walled office on the other side of the city, was that Alexandra Voss had already made her second move, and her second move had a name, and that name was Camille. Alexandra Voss did not meet Camille Rhodes in a boardroom. She did not meet her in a restaurant or a coffee shop or any of the places where important conversations are conducted with the pretense of casualness. She met her in the lobby of the Meridian Grand Hotel. Neutral ground, deliberately chosen, the kind of place where marble floors and high ceilings make everything feel consequential and everyone feels small. At precisely 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the boardroom on the 14th floor had rearranged the entire geography of Camille's life. Camille arrived 4 minutes early. She had dressed carefully, not the way she used to dress, with the calculated precision of a woman assembling armor, but with the uncertain deliberateness of someone who was still learning, week by week, what she actually liked versus what she had always performed. The counselor's card was in her bag. She had not left home without it since Vivien placed it in her hand. She could not have explained why, only that it functioned as a kind of compass, a small rectangular reminder of the kind of woman she was trying, slowly and without guarantee of success, to become. Alexandra was already seated when Camille arrived. She was exactly what Camille had expected from the 2 photographs she had found online, polished in the specific way that required both money and discipline. The kind of woman who had decided long ago what impression she intended to make on every room she entered and had never once deviated from the plan. She was beautiful in an architectural way, structured, precise, entirely intentional. She stood when Camille approached and smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. But what unsettled Camille was not the smile. It was the recognition. Alexandra looked at her the way a person looks at something they have already researched thoroughly and are now simply confirming in person. "Camille," she said, as though they were already friends. "Thank you for coming." They sat. Coffee arrived without being ordered, and Alexandra, who clearly believed that the most effective way to conduct a negotiation was to make the other person feel that the negotiation had not yet begun, spent the first 10 minutes asking Camille questions about herself, her background, her ambitions, her time at Weston and Crane Real Estate, with the focused, flattering attention of a woman who was very good at making people feel seen. Camille answered carefully, "Nana," but she felt herself warming to it despite her caution. Because being seen, genuinely seen, was something she had been starved of since the boardroom, since Derek's resignation, since the slow and unglamorous work of examining herself had begun to reveal how much of her identity had been constructed from other people's approval. Then Alexandra set down her coffee cup, and the temperature in the conversation changed. "I want to be direct with you," Alexandra said. "I respect your time too much for anything else." She opened a slim folder on the table between them. "I am prepared to offer you full reinstatement at Weston and Crane Real Estate, your previous title restored, a 30% salary increase, and a seat on the Emerging Markets Committee that Derek Weston was passed over for twice." She paused. "All I need from you is information, scheduling details, the nature of Elliot Crane's current legal consultations, private correspondence if it becomes available. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal." Another pause. "Perfectly timed," Camille noted. The pause of a woman who had rehearsed this conversation many times. Simply the kind of information that a well-positioned insider would naturally have access to. Camille looked at the folder. She did not touch it. Inside her bag, 3 inches from her right hand, was the counselor's card. She thought about Vivien at the altar. Cream roses trembling, the doors opening for the wrong woman. She thought about Vivien in the hallway, placing that card in her hand without conditions, without performance, without the need for anyone to witness the doing of it. She thought about what the counselor had said to her in their 3rd session, quietly and without judgment. The clearest sign of genuine change is not what you do when it is easy. It is what you do when someone makes it very, very easy to go back to who you were. This was that moment. Camille understood it with a clarity that surprised her. The specific, clean clarity of a woman standing at a crossroads who can see both roads completely and must choose right now, with Alexandra's eyes on her face and 30% and a committee seat on the table between them, which direction she was actually going to walk. She closed the folder. "No," she said. Alexandra did not react immediately. She studied Camille the way you study a calculation that has returned an unexpected result. Not with anger, but with the recalibrating attention of someone who needs to understand where their model was wrong. "Think carefully," Alexandra said. Her voice had not changed, but something beneath it had. "Vivienne Hartford is not who you think she is. The woman you are protecting, the woman you think showed you grace, is sitting on a foundation that is about to be legally challenged in ways that will leave everyone connected to Elliot Crane significantly exposed. I am offering you a way out before the building comes down." She leaned forward slightly. "I am offering you the winning side." Camille picked up her bag. She stood, and she looked at Alexandra Voss, this polished, architectural, precisely intentional woman, with an expression that was not hostility and not superiority, but something quieter and more permanent than both. "The last time someone offered me the winning side," Camille said, "I took it, and I have spent every day since then sitting across from a counselor trying to understand who I became in that moment." She pushed the folder back across the table. "I know what the winning side costs. I am not paying it again." She walked out of the Meridian Grand Hotel into the November air. The same November air that had been falling on Vivien at a bus stop 3 years ago when everything that was broken began, slowly and without announcement, to be made right. And she stood on the steps for a long moment, her heart hammering, the counselor's card in her hand, understanding that she had just done the hardest thing she had ever done. Harder than the ambition, harder than the calculation, harder even than the moment she had looked at Vivien across that church and looked away. She had chosen, for the first time in a very long time, to be the person she actually wanted to be. But what Camille did not know, what she could not have known standing on those hotel steps with her heart still racing and the folder still on the table inside, was that Alexandra had anticipated refusal, had planned for it, and had already activated the second part of her strategy, the part that did not require Camille's cooperation at all, the part that required only Derek. And Derek, sitting in his smaller office across the city with the buried document open on his screen and 3 missed calls from a number he did not recognize, was already reaching for his phone. Derek Weston had always been good at reading rooms, and it was the skill that had carried him furthest in his career. The ability to walk into a space, assess the power dynamics within 30 seconds, and position himself precisely where the current was flowing strongest. It was the same skill that had made him a successful acquisitions director at Weston and Crane Real Estate. The same skill that had made him, in his worst moment, calculate that Camille was a better investment than Vivien. And it was the same skill that was now, sitting alone in his smaller office on the 9th floor of a building that smelled of new carpet and diminished ambition, failing him completely. Because Derek Weston was very good at reading rooms, but he had never been good at reading documents. The buried addendum had come to him 3 weeks ago through a contact at a title research firm he had hired as part of his hostile acquisition research. A junior analyst who had been digging through Weston and Crane Real Estate's founding documentation looking for structural vulnerabilities and had flagged the sealed addendum as an anomaly without fully understanding what it contained. Derek had opened it expecting a procedural irregularity, the kind of minor legal imperfection that acquisition lawyers could inflate into leverage. But what he found instead had stopped him completely. Margaret Hartford. He had stared at that name for a long time, long enough for the office to go dark around him and for his assistant to knock twice and leave without an answer. Margaret Hartford, Vivien's mother, the woman who had grown dahlias and believed that beauty was an act of resistance, listed as a silent founding partner of Weston and Crane Real Estate with a 20% equity stake that had never been transferred, never been legally dissolved, and never been paid out. A 20% equity stake in a company that was now worth, conservatively, $4.7 trillion. Derek was not a man given to long periods of stillness, but he sat with that number for 3 days before he told anyone. 3 days of arithmetic so staggering it made his hands unsteady. Because if Margaret Hartford's founding stake had never been legally dissolved, and the document suggested, with the carefully buried specificity of something that had been designed to be unfindable rather than resolved, then that stake had passed upon her death. Yet to her only living heir, to Vivien, which meant that Vivien Hartford, the woman he had left at an altar with cream roses trembling in her hands, the woman he had watched walk out of a boardroom on the arm of the man who owned everything, did not merely live in the house of a trillionaire. She was, potentially in pending legal confirmation, a significant equity holder in the company herself. In her own right, independently of Elliot, independently of the marriage, by inheritance from a mother who had never told her, who had perhaps never known the full extent of what she had been systematically cut out of. It was on the third day that Alexandra Voss called. Derek answered because the number was blocked, and blocked numbers, in his experience, belonged either to people with nothing to offer or people with everything. Alexandra introduced herself in 2 sentences. Her name, her connection to Elliot, and then said, with the directness of someone who had already mapped the conversation thoroughly, "I know what you found, and I know you don't fully understand it yet, but I do, and I am prepared to help you use it, if you are prepared to help me in return." Derek should have hung up, the version of Derek Weston that Vivien had loved, the one who had said, "You always know exactly who I am" on a Christmas morning while holding a silver-wrapped bottle of cologne. That version would have recognized the specific gravity of Alexandra's voice and understood that people who call from blocked numbers with fully formed propositions are never offering partnerships. They are offering positions in a plan that was designed before you arrived and will continue after you leave. But that Derek was 3 years and one collapsed face behind him now. The Derek sitting in the small office with the new carpet answered the call and listened and felt, for the first time since the boardroom, the seductive warmth of believing he was back in the room where the current was flowing. Alexandra's proposal was elegant in the way that traps are elegant, simple on the surface, devastating in the mechanism. She would provide Derek with the legal framework to challenge Weston and Crane Real Estate's ownership structure using the buried document as the foundation. In exchange, Derek would present the document publicly at the upcoming annual shareholder meeting, 3 weeks away, framing it as evidence of financial impropriety and triggering a mandatory board investigation that would freeze the company's operations and force Elliot into a defensive legal position that would consume his attention, his resources, and his time. What Alexandra did not tell Derek, what she had no intention of telling him until it was too late for him to change course, was that the document, presented publicly, would not damage Elliot. It would not freeze the company. It would not give Derek the leverage he imagined. Because Alexandra had read the document more carefully than Derek had, and she understood something he had missed entirely in his 3 days of staggering arithmetic. The document did not just reveal Margaret Hartford's buried stake, it revealed the name of the person who had paid to have it sealed. And that name was not Elliot Crane. It was Elliot's father, acting alone, without his partner's knowledge in the earliest days of the company, who had buried Margaret Hartford's stake. Not out of malice, the accompanying correspondence suggested, but out of the specific catastrophic paternalism of a man who had decided that a woman with a sick husband and a young daughter in Dahlia window boxes did not need the complexity of $1 trillion inheritance and had made that decision for her without her consent. Alexandra knew that presenting this document publicly would not destroy Elliot. It would humanize him, reveal him as the son of a flawed man who had wronged Vivien's family, a wrong that Elliot himself had not known about and had no part in creating. It would generate public sympathy for Vivien on a scale that no legal challenge could survive, and it would, in the process, expose Derek as the man who had weaponized a dead woman's stolen legacy for a hostile acquisition play, destroying whatever remained of his professional reputation in a single public moment. Alexandra was not trying to take the company through Derek. She was using Derek to clear the board, to create enough noise and legal disruption that Elliot would be forced to the negotiating table. where Alexandra, as the former fiancé with a pre-existing legal claim she had been quietly building for 2 years, intended to be waiting. And Derek stood up at the shareholder meeting 3 weeks later, in a room full of investors and board members and legal teams and journalists who had been tipped off by an anonymous source the night before. And he presented the document. His voice was steady. His suit was expensive. His expression carried the careful confidence of a man who believed he was making the move that would restore everything he had lost. He had been speaking for 4 minutes when the first lawyer stood up. Not Elliot's lawyer, not the board's lawyer. Vivienne's lawyer. A woman in a charcoal suit who introduced herself with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting in this room for exactly this moment. Who had been waiting, in fact, for 3 weeks. And ever since Vivienne and Elliot had found the document together at the kitchen table, with the dahlias blooming and the tea going cold, and who proceeded in the next 6 minutes to present the full legal response that Vivienne had prepared. Not to defend, not to deflect, but to claim Margaret Hartford's 20% stake, legally, completely, in Vivienne's name. Derek stood at the podium and watched the current he had been so certain he was riding reverse direction entirely, and felt for the second time in 2 years his face do the thing it had no defense against. It collapsed. But the most devastating moment of that shareholder meeting was not Derek's collapse. It was what happened 30 seconds later, when the doors at the back of the room opened, and the person who walked through them was the last person anyone in that room expected to see. And what that person said changed everything, including what Vivienne was about to do next. The person who walked through the doors at the back of the shareholder meeting room was Camille Rhodes, not the Camille who had stood in a church in a champagne dress with calculated eyes and a borrowed future. Not the Camille who had sat across from Alexandra Voss in the Meridian Grand Hotel and almost, for the space of 1 terrible minute, become herself again in the worst possible way. This was a different Camille. Quieter, less assembled, more present. The Camille who had been sitting across from a counselor twice a week and learning slowly and with great difficulty. Watch the difference between the person she had performed for 11 years and the person she actually was underneath the performance. She was carrying a folder. The room watched her walk to the front with the specific attention of a room that has already witnessed 2 extraordinary things in the last 10 minutes and understands instinctively that the third will be the largest. Derek saw her first, and something in his expression shifted from collapsed to confused, because Camille's presence here made no sense inside any version of events he had constructed. Alexandra, seated near the back of the room where she had positioned herself to observe rather than participate, went very still in the way that predators go still when the environment produces a variable they did not account for. Camille stopped beside Vivienne's lawyer. She did not look at Derek. She did not look at Alexandra. She looked at Vivienne, who was seated in the second row beside Elliot, her 4th leather notebook closed in her lap. Her expression carrying the composed attentiveness of a woman who had known Camille was coming, because Camille had called her the night before and asked, with the simple directness of someone who had stopped performing, if she could help. Vivienne had said yes, not because she had fully forgiven Camille. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a single moment, but a long and non-linear practice, more like tending dahlias than switching on a light. But because Camille had walked out of the Meridian Grand Hotel and called her instead of Alexandra, because she had chosen at the crossroads to walk toward the person she wanted to be rather than back toward the person she had been, and because Vivienne Hartford, who had been shown the cost of withheld grace once by her own mother's buried story, was not willing to withhold it from someone who was genuinely, visibly, imperfectly trying. Camille opened the folder and handed it to Vivienne's lawyer. It contained a signed affidavit, 3 pages, witnessed and notarized, detailing every conversation Camille had observed between Derek and Alexandra over the past 3 weeks. Every phone call she had been adjacent to, every detail of Alexandra's proposal at the Meridian Grand Hotel, documented with the precise, sober, clear-eyed recollection of a woman who had walked out of that meeting and immediately written down everything she remembered while sitting in her car in the hotel parking structure, because she had understood, in the moment she closed the folder and stood up, that what she had just witnessed was not finished and that the only responsible thing she could do with what she knew was ensure it reached the right hands before it caused damage that could not be undone. She had spent 3 weeks waiting for the right moment, and the right moment, it turned out, was this one. Vivienne's lawyer presented the affidavit to the board. The room processed this in stages, the way rooms process information that restructures everything they thought they understood about the preceding hour. The board members looked at their legal counsel, and the legal counsel looked at the affidavit. The journalists who had been tipped off the night before were typing with the focused intensity of people who understood that the story they had come to cover had just become a completely different and significantly larger story. Alexandra Voss stood up from her seat near the back of the room. She did it with the composure of a woman who had been in difficult rooms before and knew that composure was the last asset available to her. But the composure, for the first time in anyone's memory of her, was not quite complete. There was something beneath it, not fear exactly, something more specific than fear. The expression of a woman who has spent 3 years building a plan with absolute precision and has just watched it disassembled, piece by piece, caused by the one variable she had fundamentally and fatally miscalculated. She had miscalculated Vivien, not Elliot's legal team, not the document, not Derek's incompetence or Camille's refusal. She had miscalculated the specific, quiet, load-bearing strength of a woman who had been broken at an altar and had chosen, in the aftermath of that breaking, to become someone that the people who broke her were structurally incapable of defeating, because the weapons they knew how to use required a target who needed what they were offering, and Vivien Hartford had stopped needing what they were offering a long time ago. Alexandra walked out of the shareholder meeting without speaking, not dramatically, not with the sweeping exit of a villain who intends to return. Simply and finally, with the way people leave rooms when they understand that there is nothing left in the room for them. Her legal claim, presented to Elliot's lawyers the following week, was reviewed, assessed, and settled quietly. Not because it had merit, but because Elliot, who was constitutionally uninterested in prolonged conflict, instructed his team to find a resolution that was fair and final and allowed everyone to move forward. Alexandra received a settlement that was generous by any reasonable measure. But it was not the company, it was not the Trillionaire, and it was not the life she had calculated and recalculated and returned for. It was simply an ending, clean and unambiguous and entirely of her own making. Derek Weston's hostile acquisition play collapsed the same afternoon the affidavit was presented. His investors withdrew within 48 hours. Not because they were instructed to, but because men who invest in weapons expect those weapons to fire in the right direction, and Derek's had not. He did not resign from his smaller firm. He was quietly asked to leave, and he drove home that evening through the same November streets he had driven for 3 years, telling himself he had chosen correctly. But this time, alone in the car with no performance required and no audience to manage, he did not tell himself that. He drove in silence. And the silence, for the first time, felt like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of a mistake. 3 months later, Derek Weston began attending a men's accountability group on Thursday evenings in a church basement 4 blocks from his apartment. He did not tell anyone he knew. He sat in a circle of folding chairs with men who had also, in their various ways, become the worst version of themselves when ambition and fear and pride had occupied the same space simultaneously. And he began, slowly and without the guarantee of transformation, the work of understanding how. Camille Rhodes returned to Weston and Crane Real Estate, not through Alexandra's offer, not through reinstatement, but through a formal reapplication that she submitted through the standard process because she had decided that she did not want anything she had not earned cleanly. Elliot reviewed her application personally. He approved it with a single handwritten note attached. Everyone deserves the chance to become who they are trying to be. She kept that note beside the counselor's card in her desk drawer. She looked at both of them on difficult days, which became gradually and then significantly fewer. And Vivien Hartford, whose mother's 20% equity stake was formally and legally transferred into her name 6 weeks after the shareholder meeting, making her an independent principal of Weston and Crane Real Estate in her own right. By inheritance from a woman who had believed that beauty was an act of resistance and had never known the full, extraordinary extent of what she had built, sat at the kitchen table on the morning after the legal transfer was confirmed and opened her fourth leather notebook to a fresh page. She wrote one line, "Mama, I found what they buried, and I brought it home." Then she closed the notebook and went to the windowsill and tended her dahlias, deep burgundy, with the color of something that had decided to be beautiful despite everything. And Elliot came to the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of tea and the expression she had learned to read like weather. And this time, what it said was simple and complete and entirely sufficient. It said, "We are okay." They were more than okay. They were the proof of something, the living, specific, unhurried proof that the people who underestimate you are not your enemies. They are, without knowing it, your architects. Every door they closed became a wall that held something better up. Every betrayal became a foundation. Every buried thing eventually surfaced, not to destroy, but to restore, not to wound, but to return to the person it always belonged to. The dahlias bloomed, the notebook filled, and the life that had been assembled from the wreckage of a church altar and a rain-soaked bus stop, and a counselor's card and a sealed document, and a mother's buried legacy grew, quietly and without performance, into something that none of them, not Derek, not Camille, not Alexandra, not even Vivienne herself, could have designed if they had tried, which was perhaps the whole point. The truth does not need your help to surface. It needs only your willingness to receive it when it does. Vivienne did not go looking for her mother's buried legacy. She did not set out to defeat Alexandra or expose Derek or test Camille's redemption. She simply stayed, faithful to herself, faithful to her healing, faithful to the quiet and radical practice of becoming, day by day, the person that no betrayal could permanently unmake. And in staying, she found that everything that had been taken from her, everything that had been buried, stolen, sealed, and hidden, had been accumulating interest the entire time, waiting, patient as dahlias, ready to bloom the moment the right person came to tend it. The second most unthinkable thing Vivienne did was not claim her mother's legacy. It was allow Camille to help her do it. Because the truest measure of how far you have come is not what you do to the people who hurt you. It is what you make possible for the people who are trying, imperfectly, belatedly, genuinely, to be better. Dear viewers, this story was never about a trillionaire or a real estate company or a hostile acquisition play. It was about what happens to a person when they decide, against every wound and against every reasonable justification for bitterness, to remain faithful to who they actually are. Vivienne taught us in part 1 that grace is possible. She taught us in part 2 that grace is powerful, not soft, not naive, not the absence of strength, but the highest and most deliberate expression of it. Drop in the comments the moment in part 2 that hit you hardest. Tell me, when Camille closed that folder and walked out of the hotel, what did you feel? And if you were Derek sitting alone in that car in the silence, what would your next move have been? Every answer matters. Every story matters. And if this one stayed with you, if it taught you something, moved you somewhere, or showed you a version of strength you needed to see today, subscribe now. Because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting for you. Stories that entertain, stories that challenge, stories that leave you better than they found you, and you deserve every single one of them.